guys, welcome to the slightly overdue next episode of Fairy Tales with Jen. Now, in previous episodes, I've taken the history of a tale that we know and love. So I've done Sleeping Beauty and Hansel and Gretel and a few others, and I'll leave a link to the playlist up here if you want to check them out. But today, I want to do something slightly different, and that is looking at the influence of science and evolution in fairy tales during the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, because I think it's a really fascinating topic. I might make more videos in the future focusing on specific tales, but today I'd like to give an overview of what happened to children's literature when people in the Western world started talking about atoms and evolution, fossils and chemicals. Having worked in an antiquarian bookshop for many years, the fairy tales and moral tales published for children during the 1800s particularly fascinated me. During the Victorian times, childhood was seen as a state of purity and innocence to be sought after and revered and worshipped, and that wasn't a new idea, but you could see why it was particularly relevant to that time. In the early 1800s, population in the towns in the UK exploded, disease was everywhere, infant mortality rates were really high, and if you survived in a working class background in the first few years of your life, you'll be sent to work from a very young age in the workhouse or down mines, and the conditions there were so terrible that you weren't likely to survive there either. Those outside of the working classes were therefore taught to see their children as somehow extra special and angelic for being pure and outside of that awful environment, and were to be looked after all the more. So at this time, many moral tales were being published by the Religious Tract Society. They'd be in small volumes that were normally cloth bound with gilt titles, and in these stories women would be told off for not doing what they were told, and children would be encouraged to be pious and angelic, lest they remain or become poor and unloved. But whilst this age of childhood and innocence was being revered, it brought into question for some whether the idea of fairy tales was something that was still relevant. Science was being talked about everywhere in many different forms. Wasn't that something that children should be taught from a young age instead of nursery tales and fairy tales? Instead of fairies and nonsense, wasn't the real world more interesting than make-believe? Shouldn't they be learning about that instead? So how did some writers start merging myth with fact to really get with the times? Well, in 1817, there was a writer called W.F. Sullivan who published a story called The Young Liar with 2 exclamation points. It was about a young boy called Wilfred Story who was told tales by his nurse, Mrs. Fibwell. See what they did there. And he grew up to be a liar because he was so used to hearing things that weren't true that he lied to everyone he met. Fiction had made him bad. He tried to get money out of his friends, he lied to his family, and he died a very dramatic death. So in that instance, we see children being taught that fiction is bad and fact is better. One scientific thing that I think is really interesting, that during the 18th century, there was a diagram that was made locating fairyland as a specific place within the brain. So scientists could point to it and show it to you. It was a way to normalize the other by putting it inside you. The other isn't out there, it's inside you and you're making it up. And not only that, but we can show you exactly where you're doing it. It was something that J.M. Barrie used later down the line when he created Neverlands, because he said that Neverlands were all different because they were all invented in each child's head separately. So in this case, with this diagram, the other isn't out there, it's inside you, and that's also a commentary on mental illness as well. It's their rationalization that they can literally point to fairyland as somewhere inside your brain. At the other end of the scale, but still trying to rationalize fairies, some writers did something completely different. They introduced a concept called fairyology. Anthropologists said perhaps fairies were actually some sort of species that we hadn't yet discovered. When the first dinosaur bones were discovered, some scientists believed that those were the bones of giants. So if that was the case, then maybe fairies existed out there. This was the age of discovery. If new things were being discovered under the ground, in the sea, on foreign lands, perhaps fairies were just another one of those things, and they should be spoken about in the way that we talked about fossils, but not as this imaginary thing that doesn't actually exist. For instance, in Samuel Johnson's dictionary of 1755, the entry of dragon was down as a creature that possibly was imaginary, only possibly. And when dinosaur bones were being discovered, dragons were a great way to explain dinosaurs to children who were learning about what was going on in the world around them, because dragons were something that they knew from storybooks. So again, it was that melting of fact and fiction. In the 1850s, a book was published called The Fossil Spirit, A Boy's Dream of Geology, which was about a creature that kept on morphing and changing its appearance. One of those appearances was a dragon, which reflected the the theory of evolution that was starting to float around at that time. Speaking of evolution, in the 1850s, it was the time of the Great Exhibition, which is probably something that you've read about or heard about. If not in history, then you've probably read about it in books. For instance, in North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, the Great Exhibition is something that they go to quite often. They travel down to London to this huge building in Crystal Palace where there's a display of technology from all around the world, the latest inventions, and also oddities from around the world as well. The paradox perhaps of that time was that scientists and philosophers were trying to understand the world around them through logic and rationalization, putting science and discovery over magic and religion. But in doing so, they were actually asking the public to believe in something that they couldn't see, which was really like religion. They were showing them evolution. There were fossils there, and then there's us. But there is a gap in the middle where they're asking them to have some faith. And because there's this gap at that time when they're trying to explain evolution to the public, some people decided that they would try and exploit that gap. They decided that they would try and fill it with stories and with unusual people. Enter the freak show. Now, I could say a lot of things about the freak show, but what I want to talk about specifically here is people who were exploiting this idea of the missing part of evolution. And they exploited people by bringing them onto the stage in the Great Exhibition and saying that these people were proof of Darwin's theory of evolution. They were the missing link in the evolution theory. They brought people on who they decided had defied the norms of society, people who had, they believed, been affected by nature, who could somehow be historical humans, that these people were somehow somewhere in the middle between animal and human, and they put them on show for everyone to see. Covering a wide time frame to do with the freak show, here are a couple of things that were said about people who were exhibited. One was Charles Byrne. He was a man who was nearly 8 feet tall, and he was called the Irish Giant. And people said he was that tall because he'd been conceived on top of a haystack. Madam Howard was said to have been born with a mane because her mother had watched her father be eaten by a lion while she was pregnant. And the lobster boy, who had ectrodactyly, which is what I have, was said to have been born that way because when he was in his mother's womb, she had a craving for shellfish. I've always been really fascinated with the link between disability and deformity and mythology and all the areas that that covers. It's actually what I talk about a lot in my own writing, the writing that I'm doing at the moment. And I'll leave links down below to some non-fiction on this area that you might want to check out. I've also got this one here, which is Spectacle of Deformity, Freak Shows and Modern British Culture. And that idea of folklore and disability and deformity crossing over is explored brilliantly in Beyond the Pale by Emily Urquhart, which I've mentioned on this channel before. I also did a podcast with Emily, which I'll link up here and also down below. Apart from in freak shows, the idea of myth meeting fact and fairyology continued in children's classrooms. There was often the idea that fairies would be shown as part of entomology, so the study of insects. So if you had an image, a diagram of different insects, fairies would be one of them, and you could study their different body parts. In 1885, Andrew Lang wrote a story called That Very Mab about a fairy who was actually part butterfly, who said that all of the steam machinery in towns had chased fairies out of nature. Margaret Gatty wrote a book called Parables of Nature, in which she tried to make religion into a science-based subject that children could study so that it wouldn't get left behind. She talked about the idea of caterpillars turning into butterflies, being like humans ascending into heaven as angels, and perhaps therefore religion could be something that could be scientifically studied. Science in some form also crept into the fairy tales of Hans Christian Andersen. He wrote a fairy tale about a butterfly who thought he was better than everyone else, more beautiful, more fantastic, more fine, and refused all of the suitors that he was introduced to. But because he was so rare and so beautiful, he was then captured by an entomologist and shoved in a cabinet and put on display, and never got to marry anyone at all. So don't hang about, kids, otherwise that might happen to you. The Water Babies incorporated evolution into its story. Alice in Wonderland saw Alice out on a quest for logic rather than adventure, but she ended up getting both. The Greswell brothers wrote a book called The Wonderland of Evolution, which had in it a fairy called Chance, who oversaw anything to do with evolution. Henry Morley wrote a book called The Water Drops, a Fairy Tale, in which he wrote about the cloud people who lived up in the clouds and who released droplets of water as rain, who were actually fairies that fell down to earth and became polluted. This was obviously a social commentary on pollution, especially in large cities. The River Thames had actually been renamed by some as Monster Soup. Now that we could see what was in substances, what was in water, what was around us, microscopes were often found in upper middle class families as toys. We could look and see what we previously couldn't see, and we didn't like what we saw. So with this knowledge of atoms and with chemicals and with hidden things, the idea came forward that maybe these things were somehow related to fairies, because we can't see those either. In 1887, Lucy Ryder Mayer wrote a book called Real Fairy Folks, The Wonderland of Chemistry, an exploration of the world of atoms, where atoms were fairies with chemical properties and you could balance equations by counting fairies' wings. So with this idea that there are microscopic, dirty, chemical things that you can't see, and perhaps fairies as literally microscopic things that you can't see, marketing companies latched onto this idea that maybe these two things should be brought together, because maybe as you can't see both of them with the naked eye, one could destroy the other. So they had this idea to bring into the market something called fairy soap. Almost like you've got fairies or pixies helping you around the house keep things clean. And this idea stuck and continued, and we still have it. And it's why we have fairy washing up liquid. Seriously. There are so many fascinating anecdotes to do with science and children's literature, but these were the ones that I wanted to mention today. I hope you guys find it as interesting as I do. Let me know in the comments section down below. I'll also leave, as I said in the description, links to books that you might want to go to for further reading. I hope you guys are having a great week, and I'll speak to you very soon. Lots of bookish love. Bye!